Welcome today to the Asia Week New York and the Winter Show joint panel presentation. I'm Dessa Goddard, former chairman of Asia Week New York and a member of the Asia Week New York Planning Committee. Asia Week New York is an association of prominent international Asian art galleries, major auction houses, numerous museum and Asian art cultural institutions who join together to collaborate and celebrate Asian art with year-round activities for our audience of collectors, institutions, and academics. The main focus of our activities surrounds March Asia Week, this year held between March 13th and the 21st, a period of exhibitions, gallery openings, events, and auctions of Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Indian, Himalayan, and South and Southeast Asian art. This is the 5th year of our partnership with the Winter Show to bring you important conversations on topics related to the history of art and collecting with renowned scholars in multiple fields of interest. Today, as we have stated, the topic of our panel is Art in the Great Expositions, the World Wide Web of Taste, 1876 to 1904, which will focus on the aesthetic impact these global events have had on late 19th century American decorative arts and paintings. Using the World Fairs of 1876 in Philadelphia, the 1878, 1889, and 1900 fairs in Paris, the 1893 Chicago Columbia Exposition, and the 1904 St. Louis World's Fair as the setting. Our distinguished panelists will talk about the impact of Japanese art and crafts on American decorative arts, especially Tiffany, the evolution of the American Renaissance period as a burst of civic interest in monuments of the human form, and the participation of American artists at the fair. Our panelists, all specialists in this area, in this period, will focus on aspects of these topics which have been the subject of their recent exhibitions and ongoing studies. We have much to cover, so you have seen their extensive biographies in the Winter Show and AWNY website, so I will introduce our illustrious panelists briefly. Annette Blaugrund, the former director of the National Academy Museum and School of Fine Arts and currently guest curator at the Columbia University's Wallach Art Gallery. Joe Earle, global senior consultant for Japanese art at Bonhams and a former museum curator and director. Medill Higgins Harvey, the Ruth Bigelow Wriston Curator of American Decorative Arts and manager of the Henry R. Luce Center for American Art at the Metropolitan Museum of Art here in New York. And Mark D. Mitchell, the Holcomb T. Green Curator of American Paintings and Sculpture at the Yale University Art Gallery in New Haven. World's fairs since 1851, some of the maps shown here, had multiple purposes: to showcase the ongoing innovations of industrialization and scientific development, and the promotion of individual national character and artistic and cultural achievements of the participating nations. From the credited first of the international expositions, hosted by Prince Albert and Robert Cole in 1851, the Crystal Palace exhibition, the 1862 International Exposition in London, both with 6 million attendees. There were subsequently 5 international expositions hosted in Paris, or hosted by Paris and France. Here we have the Exposition Universelle in 1855 with 5 million attendees. The Exposition Universelle in 1867, and the Exposition Universelle of 1878, which attracted more than 13 million people, to the spectacular 1889 Exposition, which drew over twice the 1878 attendees, and in which the 889-foot tall Eiffel Tower was unveiled as the architectural centerpiece of the fair. To the 1900 Exposition, which brought 51 million people to Paris to attend the 6-month-long exhibition. the first time that the Olympic Games were combined with a World's Fair. It was the Great Expositions of the late 19th century that provided the spark for collecting in the young country of America. Fresh from the upheavals caused by the Civil War and facing the dramatic impact of the Industrial Revolution on American urban life, highly successful business leaders assumed the role of cultural leadership and responsibility to enrich the lives of the public. These leaders of industry founded railroads. You see the railroad system here between 1870 and 1890, provided financing and ran the newly established art museums, libraries, orchestras, public parks, and these expositions, which were designed in part to uplift, entertain, and provide a cultural environment for the American public. Here we have, starting with the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition in Fairmount Park, which had 10 million attendees, and which featured such technological advancements as the telephone, the typewriter, and introduced such popular novelties as root beer, popcorn, and bananas to the American public. The 1893 Chicago Columbia Exposition, attended by 27 million people in the 6 months it was held, in which the Ferris wheel became a novel centerpiece of that time period. The 1991 Exposition in Buffalo, with 8 million attendees, and the 1904 St. Louis, Louisiana Purchase Exposition, which had 19.7 million attendees in the 6 months it was held, where the new inventions were private automobiles, or the new showcased inventions were the private automobile, the X-ray machine, and to the public, things like ice cream cones, hot dogs, iced tea, and cotton candy. It was the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition and the 1893 Columbia Exposition that introduced America on a wide scale to the arts of Japan and China. Japan had in Europe since 1862 found a highly receptive audience for its carefully engineered offerings of decorative art. And it took America by storm in Philadelphia. The newly formed Meiji government used the response from Philadelphia as a tool for negotiating the move of a small portion of the display of its display at the Columbia Exposition to the Palaces of Fine Arts in 1893 in Chicago. Joe Earle, our first speaker this afternoon, is now going to be your guide through the Japanese galleries at the Columbia Exposition, certainly the fair that was the most significant introduction of Japan and its art to the broadest audience in America. Joe?
So Japan made a small appearance in 1862 in London, as we've heard, but its really active participation in the worldwide web of taste got going with the Paris Exposition of 1867. The Japanese displays were motley. They were sent both by the government of Japan and by the government of Satsuma. So there's some problem, and it's all a little bit disorganized, but nevertheless very impressive. Seeing the opportunity, the new Meiji government that took power that very same year, 1867, quickly took advantage of further opportunities for international exposure. This started with the Vienna Exposition of 1873, another very important one, to which the government devoted, this young fledgling government devoted nearly 1% of annual GDP to its participation, an extraordinarily large sum if you think about it. And before the close of the Meiji era in 1912, Japan would go on to play a major role at international expositions in Paris 3 more times, Philadelphia in 1876, St. Louis in 1904, and Liège in 1905. Both at Vienna and at Philadelphia, this is Philadelphia, Japanese bronzes in particular were rapturously received. And in 1876, American collectors, including Henry O. Havemeyer and William Vanderbilt, started avidly acquiring Japanese art by the carload. But in the brief time available this afternoon, I'd like to focus on the World's Columbian Exposition held in Japan in 1893, and especially on Japan's participation in the Palace of Fine Arts, at over 200 square feet, then the largest art gallery ever constructed anywhere in the world. Thanks to its earlier successes, Japan was the only Asian nation granted a place in this prestigious setting, as well as the vast manufacturers and liberal arts building, many, many times larger. We should never forget the importance of that side of the display, but I'm focusing on what was regarded as fine art today. And the Japanese knew that their paintings and sculptures wouldn't make as great an impression on the American public as their porcelain, cloisonné enamel, textiles, lacquer, and metalwork. So they persuaded their hosts that the space given to Japan at the Palace of Fine Arts should be used in a quite different way than the courts occupied by other countries. Japan thus exhibited over 90% of the works in the palace that were defined as decorative art, but less than 1% of the paintings and sculptures. Freed of Western categories, the Japanese authorities still confronted two challenging tasks. First, to determine what to select in the way of contemporary painting that would retain a recognizable Japanese character. And second, and more important, in terms of number and commercial potential, to decide what types of, quote, art craft, quote, unquote, to use one of the many terms used for that area of art at the day, which things would best stack up against the great canvases and sculptures of leading American and European artists. Now, I'd like to enlist as our guide here Captain Frank Brinkley, an Irish-born journalist and authority on Japanese art and culture who'd lived in Japan since the early 1870s and whose important role in the Meiji art world was highlighted by the late great scholar Ellen P. Conant, who passed away 2 years ago, and pointed out that Brinkley, in many ways, was better informed and more influential than either Ernest Fenollosa in painting or, for that matter, Edward Sylvester Morse in ceramics. This long New York Times article, I'm not sure we can see it all on the screen, but it occupied an entire page. This was published several weeks before the fair's opening by a writer who had been given privileged access to the exhibits in Tokyo before they ever left and were shipped to the US. The article is anonymous, but the tone of voice and the opinions are very similar to a signed series of articles that Brinkley himself had written for his own local newspaper in Yokohama, the Japan Weekly Mail, which was entitled Artistic Japan in Chicago. And I think that the fact that the article refers every now and then to the learned scholar Mr. Brinkley doesn't fool me into thinking that the article wasn't itself anyway by Mr. Brinkley. So the year 1893 happened to come at something of a low point for Western-style painting in Japan, as the authorities reacted against 2 decades of modernization and tried to create a Japanese pictorial style to match the nation's international standing. Chicago offered the first major opportunity to show the fruits of this new way of thinking, combining native materials and formats with Western naturalism, perspective, and some color. Our presumed writer Brinkley gave short shrift to this painting by Hashimoto Gaho, a traditionally trained painting experimenting here with perspective and realistic portrayal of light, shadow, and mass. He wrote, "His representation of a Japanese landscape, adorned with many of the graces for which he is famous, is disfigured by blemishes which a European colorist of commonplace acquirements would instinctively avoid." Watanabe Seitei's painting of chickens in the snow fared much better. I quote again, "A happy exception to the labored attempts at demonstrating a familiarity with European forms, and illustrates the real power of the Japanese in their own peculiar province." A wonderful combination of praise and condescension that runs through all writing about Japanese art throughout the Meiji era. Similarly, Imao Keinen's Eagle and Monkey was praised for its truthfulness and feeling for nature, but the same artist's painting of carp, displayed very near the entrance to the Japanese section of the art palace, was castigated as much too large for the idea it seeks to embody, besides being liable to the charge of illegitimate trickery and effects of color. Not nearly as impactful at Chicago as the pieces that we'll look at next. The Times article devotes 6 times as many column inches to other media compared to paintings, lavishing praise not only on the works themselves, but also on the selector's, I quote again, "determination to include no objects that could not stand the test of the most rigorous critical scrutiny." Countering a recent, quote, "greedy eagerness to satisfy the demands of foreign trade," the selection of porcelain included outstanding examples of a new trend toward emulation of classic Chinese prototypes, as here by Seifu Yohei, as well as this work by Miyagawa Kozan, a great favorite with collectors today. Brinkley, we think it's Brinkley, wrote, "It will require a cultivated eye to detect all the qualities of the yellow one, which shows evidence of a skill rarely acquired by even the masters of the art." Now, to make up for the lack of large-scale frame paintings in the Western manner, Japanese textile artists, metalworkers, lacquerers, and enamelers were encouraged to adapt their techniques to pictorial format. The best-known fruit of this effort, still in Chicago's Field Museum of Natural History, is a tapestry by Kawashima Jimbei, measuring no less than 22 by 12 feet, of which our writer states that, "I have little hesitation in saying that it will throw into the background the finest Gobelin in existence. Those familiar with the pomp and splendor of the great Nikko festival, depicted here, will readily understand the magnitude of Kawashima's unique undertaking." As for metalwork, the New York Times writer wondered whether the higher award of praise will be conferred on the textile products of Japan or the superb examples of various styles of metalwork. Deprived of samurai patronage, after the custom of wearing two swords was abolished by government edict in 1876, Japan's decorative metalworkers, many of them based in Mito, north of Tokyo, had swiftly transferred their skills and indeed their residence to new skills and products in the capital city, and were especially adept at producing essentially pictorial works. Examples at Chicago included this panel by Kano Natsuo, of which the Times writes, "No completer or more characteristic piece of elaborate metal decoration has been wrought by Japanese hands." Natsuo's panel was executed in gold, silver, and the dark black, blue-black copper gold alloy known as shakudo. But a more sculptural bronze by Okazaki Sessei also caught our writer's attention. A mythical figure design, the goddess Benten playing on a musical instrument, which, though much admired here, and he means, of course, in Tokyo, where the article was written, will probably be less esteemed abroad. But the example of metalwork most praised by the Times was a group of 12 hawks, each one of them based on a real individual bird, by Suzuki Chokichi, better known earlier in the Meiji era for his magnificent bronze incense burners and other large items. The Times wrote, "The strength, the vivacity of expression, the vital animation of these spirited creatures are portrayed with a vivid reality which only an artist of extraordinary endowments could impart to cold and lifeless metals." Once thought lost, these masterpieces are now in the collection of the National Museum of Modern Art in Tokyo. Carving, whether in ivory or wood, was another of those fields where both the Times writer and Brinkley, in his signed articles published in Japan, considered that the, I quote, "excessive and unwholesome demands of trade had encouraged artisans to forsake their once cherished ideals. Nevertheless, as with porcelain, he was ready to admit that things were turning for the better, praising this figure of a monkey. Fierce excitement and the rage of disappointment are admirably depicted in this great ape's attitude and malicious face." Moving on to lacquer, already in 1883, the French art critic Louis Gans had famously asserted that Japanese lacquer objects are the most perfect works of art that have ever issued from the hands of man. And the Times writer, while as usual still regretting a recent period of decline, considered that, I quote again, "the return to the first and best principles has been more thorough in lacquer than in the case of any of the manufacturers which temporarily yield to the commercial infection." This box by Kawanaba Icho was among the items he figured out for special praise. But more important, because it hadn't previously attracted much attention, was the commentary on the new art of cloisonné enameling, which had really more or less only started about half a century before and reached incredible levels of accomplishment by the end of the 19th century. While highlighting the achievements of Namikawa Yasuyuki, seen here, never shy of showing off his superior knowledge, the Times writer went on to praise an unrelated artist, Namikawa Yasuyuki of Tokyo, another favorite with collectors at the present day, our present day. But he deplored the fact that Yasuyuki was represented not by one of his magnificent vases or pairs of vases, but by this panel, depicting Mount Fuji, in which he wrote, "Little of Sosuke's truly extraordinary power is discernible. It is a veritable misfortune that he should have missed his mark on an occasion so important to himself and to the growing reputation of his country. History, however, has judged otherwise, and this panel is one of a handful of works from Chicago, 4 of them included in the presentation you've just seen, to have earned the official designation of Juyo Bunkazai, important cultural property in recent decades in Japan. Well, Brinkley, of course, was a specialist. The overall popular impact of Japan's participation in this great American event, particularly the Art Palace, but also the Palace and Manufactures, is perhaps best summed up in the following words from one of the many official guides to the fair. In the not very distant day, when we shall receive envoys from the inhabitants of Mars. That's a rather contemporary moment for it, isn't it? We're going to go there, apparently, but anyway. Visits from Mars were considered almost a near future possibility at the time. In those days, when we receive visitors from the inhabitants of Mars to our own international expositions, these exhibits will probably not differ very much from our own than do some of the Empire of Japan in the present Chicago show. The European or American who enters these galleries recognizes at once a new order of things and a new world, an air of having come from somewhere beyond the stars. Through careful management of the displays, the Japanese authorities succeeded triumphantly in their aim of presenting their country as a repository of a culture that was distinct from that of the West, but lost nothing when its art was shown alongside contemporary masterpieces from Europe and the United States. Japan would be less successful at the 1900 Paris Exposition, where, due to a change in the rules, the craft objects of excellence, as they were now called, had to compete directly with their European and American counterparts, and were deemed out of touch with the latest global trends. It would not be until the St. Louis Fair of 1904 that Japanese craft objects once again earned widespread admiration. Thank you. I'm now going to introduce Medill, who will speak about among other things, about the influence not just of Japanese art and design, but that of many other Asian cultures on American taste in the late 19th century. Medill.
The import and impact of the Great Expositions on American art and industry truly cannot be overstated, and Tiffany & Co.'s engagement with the fairs offers a fascinating case study. Looking at some of the works Tiffany displayed at the World's Fair, their reception, and the sources of inspiration that informed their design and creation speaks volumes about the worldwide web of taste the exhibitions fostered. My recent exhibition, Collecting Inspiration, Edward C. Moore at Tiffany & Co., explored Tiffany silver designed under Moore's direction during the second half of the 19th century in dialogue with works of art he collected from diverse moments in time and geographies. Here you see a selection of Tiffany silver produced during Moore's tenure. This was a period of unprecedented originality and innovation at Tiffany, and the World's Fairs were central to the firm's creative trajectory and commercial success. Edward Moore traveled regularly to London and Paris and attended the Great Expositions in both Europe and the United States. He carefully studied the artistic techniques, manufacturing processes, and aesthetic sensibilities on display at the fairs. And what he saw prompted a drive to create silver unlike any he or his staff had seen before. Silver distinguished by technical virtuosity and ambitious creativity. Here are just a few of the thousands of objects Moore collected. Moore and his team were fascinated by the colors, textures, patterns, and shapes found in works of art from East and West Asia, as well as the classical world and modern Europe. Moore was committed to investing silver with color and tonal effects found in objects like those on the screen. Refusing to be fettered by the traditionally monochromatic limits of his medium, before diving into the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition, it's worth mentioning that the Paris Exposition Universelle in 1867 was notable for the exposure to displays from Japan, China, the Ottoman Empire, Tunisia, Egypt, and Morocco that it provided Moore and all of the other fairgoers, but also because it was Tiffany & Co.'s debut on the international stage. Its display, which was awarded the bronze medal, featured predominantly Neo-Grec and classical style silver, but also included some quote-unquote Mooresque silver, among which was this tea set or another just like it. Here we have an early manifestation of Moore's engagement with non-Western decorative vocabulary, one informed by the art of Asia and the Islamic world. The 1876 Philadelphia World's Fair was a watershed event for both Moore and Tiffany, and had a transformative influence on American art and taste. For many in the US, the fair provided their first exposure to the arts of Japan. The Japanese displays introduced novel forms, decorative vocabularies, and most notably for Moore and Tiffany, new metallurgic techniques and alloys that yielded varied tones and patterns. They sparked a mania for Japanese goods and wares in Japanese-inspired taste. The fair featured more than 200 major structures, including Japanese, Syrian, Tunisian, and Turkish bazaars, and a quote-unquote Moorish villa, and displays from China, Egypt, Brazil, and numerous European countries. And here we're looking at a photograph of Egypt's display on the left and an image of some of the Turkish works exhibited on the right. Moore owned objects that resembled many shown in all of these displays, and Tiffany's silver reveals creative engagement with the aesthetic sensibilities and artistic techniques manifest in the diverse exhibits. At the Philadelphia Fair, Tiffany presented a lavish display and won numerous awards. They exhibited silver, jewelry, and fancy goods, and accounts of the fair particularly noted the stylistic diversity of Tiffany's silver. This photo of selections from their display offers a tantalizing hint of the variety and grandeur of their exhibit. And here we see creative takes on classical, Indian, Asian, and Native American sources. At the fair, Tiffany introduced, with much fanfare and laudatory press, works they identified as quote-unquote chromatically decorated silver, a technique they proudly described as entirely new. Silver endowed with such color and tonal effects was revelatory and enthusiastically received by American and international patrons attending the fair. This picture was acquired by the MFA Boston directly from the fair, becoming the first piece of Tiffany silver to enter a museum collection. The decoration and chromatic effects were inspired by mixed metal wares from the Islamic world, as well as West and East Asian works in other media. These two objects from Moore's collection give us a sense of the sorts and range of objects that prompted such innovative silver work. This tea set exemplifies the results of Tiffany's tireless experimentation and technical virtuosity. Here, silver, copper, and yellow are combined, a complex undertaking because copper and yellow destroy each other when exposed to heat. Thus, the design had to incorporate thin areas of silver to ensure the copper and yellow never touched. These Iranian works from Moore's collection again reveal that inspiration is drawn from works of varied media, dates, and cultures, fully embodying the spirit of cultural, intellectual, and commercial exchange that define the world's fairs. At the Philadelphia Exposition, Moore forged a particularly fruitful connection with the influential British designer and design theorist Christopher Dresser. He then contracted with Dresser to acquire works during his upcoming travels in Japan, giving Dresser carte blanche to choose, quote, any objects that I, Dresser, might think calculated to aid in the development of their silversmith business. He proceeded to send 160 cases of works of art from Japan to Tiffany in 1877. Here you see examples of Japanese objects acquired by Moore, both historic and contemporary. Works like these fueled much experimentation and innovation, culminating in Tiffany's display at the 1878 Paris Fair. Moore and his team achieved even greater success at the 1878 fair. Tiffany won the grand prize, Moore a gold medal, and 5 members of the staff were awarded various other medals. The firm's dazzling display represented a paradigm shift for the silversmithing industry. This 1878 photograph shows some works from Tiffany's display. Accounts of the fair stress the novelty and originality of the exhibit and wax poetic about Tiffany's Japanese-inspired designs, incorporating mixed metal alloys and laminated metal. These exquisite Damascene candlesticks were the first items the firm selected for inclusion in their Paris display. They represent mastery of what was a new technique for Tiffany, damascening. Without exposure to works like this Iranian helmet from Moore's collection, these candlesticks wouldn't have come into being. Moore's visit to the 1873 World's Fair in Vienna likely sparked his interest in incorporating damascening into Tiffany's repertoire, as this damascene tray from his collection bears a stamp indicating it was purchased from India's display at the Vienna Fair. This is just one small example of the profound impact the World's Fairs had on aesthetic sensibilities, artistic techniques, and taste for not only Moore and his staff, but also consumers throughout the United States and the world. Tiffany's silver ornamented in the Japanese style became the star of the show. This 20¼ inch high vase was the centerpiece of their display. Called the conglomerate vase because it combined or conglomerated all of the various mixed metal alloys, it asserted to the world that Tiffany had mastered Japanese metalworking techniques. Indeed, press and the public alike were enraptured. One critic wrote that Tiffany had created, quote, a new order of production. Interestingly, similar language to that we recently heard from Joe. Among the many prominent patrons who acquired Tiffany's Japanesque wares was the Japanese commissioner at the fair, who sent numerous Tiffany silver works home to Japan as models of superior art. Japan's interest was a function of both wanting to understand how Tiffany had managed to so successfully replicate Japanese techniques and wanting craftspeople in Japan to gain insights into Western taste so that they could produce wares that would appeal to Western consumers. Thus, inspiration fueled by these World's Fairs is multidirectional. Here is the vase surrounded by Japanese objects from Moore's collection, and I find it fascinating to see that the colors, textures, and decorative vocabulary found in Japanese art of varied media all informed its design and execution. Tiffany also participated in the Paris Exposition of 1889 with what was described as the most elaborate booth in the exhibition. While Japanese-inspired silver remained a central feature of their production, it was their so-called Saracenic silver, much of which featured colorful enamel decoration inspired by Persian enameled glass and ceramics, that stole the show. The press particularly singled out Tiffany's mastery of opaque enamels in both their silverwares and jewelry. Following the fair, the American public had the opportunity to view Tiffany's award-winning wares at its Union Square store. So now to 1893. Tiffany mounted a grand and much heralded display on home soil at the Columbian World's Fair in Chicago. All of the inventive designs and technical innovations the firm had achieved in the preceding decades laid the foundation for Tiffany's stunning exhibition in Chicago. Damascening was taken to new heights with the Viking Punch Bowl, referencing the Viking voyage to North America as an antecedent of Columbus's 1492 voyage, which the fair celebrated. So here, Celtic and Scandinavian motifs are realized with techniques inspired by works from the Islamic world, all of which came to Moore's and the public's attention in very large part through World's Fairs. The virtuosic control of enamel and the subtle tonal shifts that Tiffany exhibited to acclaim at the preceding fair in Paris were further perfected in works like this revolver, a joint venture between Tiffany and Smith & Wesson that was shown at the Chicago Fair. This magnificent example of Tiffany enameling was acquired by the Chicago Railroad magnate General Joseph T. Torrance and would have signaled Torrance's sophistication and progressive, refined taste. I'll conclude my discussion with Tiffany's Magnolia vase. This technical and artistic marvel described by period press as a triumph, was the culmination of years of focused work and experimentation. Not content with having mastered enameling, Moore wanted to naturalistically render the velvety texture of magnolia blossoms. This required finding a way to produce enamels with a matte finish. Not only was the soft matte finish of the enamel an unprecedented accomplishment, but the technical virtuosity required to get enamels to adhere to the undulating silver surface is something silversmiths and enamelists still can't fully explain today. In keeping with the nationalistic theme of the exhibition, Tiffany touted the quote-unquote American materials and iconography of the vase. It's fashioned of domestically mined silver and gold, ornamented with North American opals, and the plants depicted represent different parts of the United States, all presented on a form inspired by Native American vessels. The World's Fair provided a stage on which Tiffany could assert itself as the nation's preeminent silversmithing firm. Drawing on historical and contemporary Western and non-Western sources of inspiration encountered at World's Fairs, Tiffany revolutionized the design and making of silver and captured the attention of an international clientele. Moore and his team at Tiffany understood the promotional and marketing power of the fairs and strategically used the displays and the attendant press to enhance the firm's reputation and increase demand for its silver. It was at and through the Great Expositions that Tiffany transformed itself from a small stationery and fancy goods retailer into a, if not the leading silversmith on the world stage. Tiffany silver made its way into homes throughout much of the world because of the opportunities presented by the World's Fairs. They contributed to and benefited immeasurably from the global network of tastes the fairs cultivated. So with that, as Joe and I have discussed, this age of great international expositions introduced fresh ideas and fostered cross-cultural creative exchange. I'm now pleased to turn over the microphone to Mark Mitchell, who will shift our attention to the fine arts and how the human figure gained prominence, even ubiquity, in America, both at the fairs and life more broadly.
Good afternoon. I'm very pleased to be with you today and to have the opportunity to change our gear a little bit and to bring us into the context of American fine art. This is a talk that develops from an exhibition that we just recently closed at the Yale University Art Gallery on the prominence of the human figure in American art of this almost identical period to the era covered in this panel. And so it's an opportunity for us to think about not just the ways in which influences arrived in the United States and helped these artists to expand their sphere of influence, but also how American artists sought to join a wider climate of art and taste across the globe. For American artists, this was an age of realignment that really coincided with the aftermath of the Civil War. Even American art historians, when I tell them that at the Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition in 1876, that depictions of the Civil War, which had ended 11 years earlier, were prohibited, there is surprise and sort of real kind of awareness that that presence of that history remained very firmly fixed in the American imagination, even a decade later. So after this moment of the centennial, this is when we see a great shift. It is the centennial itself, the American exhibitions at the centennial, that help American artists to see a need for change. That the National School, predominantly a school of landscape painting that had been dominant in American practice up to the centennial and that was featured at the centennial, really was now out of step with the taste for art in this country thereafter. So it was the centennial that was the pivot. Interestingly, and I've picked an object to start us with that will be familiar to all of you, but it is one that also creates a sense of context for this whole shift in American taste. The Statue of Liberty, enlightening, or as it is sometimes translated, lighting the world, the idea was developed in 1865 at the end of the American Civil War in homage to the emancipation of enslaved people in the United States during the course of the Civil War. It is as much a monument to emancipation and the end of slavery as it is to commemorate the centennial of the foundation of the country in 1776. So when we look at this image, we are very familiar with its upward appearance. We look up at the Statue of Liberty. But when you look down at the Statue of Liberty, what you see is the broken chain on which she stands. This is a depiction specifically of the breaking of the bonds of slavery that have been defining American history up to that point. The sculpture itself was conceived as a depiction of Franco-American friendship. And so looking at this sculpture and its aspiration to be the highest point in New York when it was eventually installed in 1886, we get a sense of the ambition and also the language of the body that would come to dominate American art in the late 19th century. This is a pivot, a tremendous pivot in the practice of American art up to this point. When we think about American art up to this time, we are largely talking about portraiture, landscape painting, still life painting. We almost never talk about the human figure, certainly not in a civic role. So we are seeing a huge transition, and it is this sort of age of expositions in which American artists are witnessing the prominence of the figure to art worldwide, that they want to join that practice. They are no longer keen to be a school of national artists. They want to be part of a wider practice, a wider taste for the principles of art and its work in civic life. Like many of the works of this period, the Statue of Liberty made the rounds. You see it here, a piece of it in the 1884 Universal Exposition in Paris. It would also, the torch would make an appearance at the Centennial in Philadelphia, and it would remain on view from 1876 until 1882 here in New York in Madison Square Park. So there is this way in which even images as familiar to us as the Statue of Liberty are part of this movement of objects into very different contexts, from Paris to New York to Philadelphia and beyond, that really creates a sense of familiarity with these images. They become touchstones of taste and practice throughout the period. However, I bet you can't guess what this is. On the inside of the Statue of Liberty, we find a marvel of modernity. We find a scaffold, a structure built not by an artist, but by Gustave Eiffel. So the outside of the Statue of Liberty is a familiar, perhaps even conservative depiction of the human figure, but on the inside we see a rather forward-looking, engineered construct of a space, of a design that just a few years later in 1889 would become the Eiffel Tower, an image of modernism that stays with us, another lighthouse, another beacon that would reach out far beyond and reach out into the distance. Here in Paris in 1889, you see, Paris 1900, you see a depiction encircled in red, the remarkable sculpture by the American Augustus St. Gaudens, a depiction of the memorial monument to William Tecumseh Sherman, the Union General. This is a moment of real arrival for American artists. And we are talking about a time when sharing these works in public, this was very much the opportunity the Americans found to share their work more widely and also to get feedback. So part of the reason that our exhibition really focused on studies, and I should stress that what you're seeing is a plaster model for the Sherman Monument. This is a work that St. Gaudens is still developing in 1900. It would be installed in 1903 here in Grand Army Plaza at 59th Street. But here, what you're seeing in Paris is a work in progress. The artists use these exhibitions as really cosmopolitan displays of artistic practice of the time. They are not trying to withdraw from the community of artists. They are trying to compete and participate in the language of the body that would prevail throughout this period of the Great Expositions. Remarkably, this would not only be a kind of turning point of St. Gaudens' career, it would catapult him to prominence, not just as the leading American sculptor of his time, but a leading sculptor of his time. The Sherman Monument was hailed at the Paris Exposition as one of the finest works of sculpture of its time. So you see American artists not just trying to participate and gain prominence. You see them here in the middle. This is the Grand Palais. We still know it as an exhibition hall today. And you can see in this vast space, the Sherman Monument standing proud directly in the middle, not in a sort of a national booth, not in a corner, but right in the middle of this vast display of sculptural ambition. Over time, the artists like St. Gaudens and many others would continue to develop their ideas for individual works and individual figures. And sculpture is especially embracing of this practice. When we look at the sculptures of this period, we see artists developing their ideas, even when it's a commission. St. Gaudens continued to develop the figure of this woman who is known as Victory Peace in St. Gaudens's accounts of the work. This figure he would continue to develop over time and want to create as a freestanding figure separate from the monument of Sherman. You can see how individual ideas, individual forms continue to inspire these artists through time. One of the things that's so special about that is the way in which St. Gaudens and American artists in particular really cherished the presence and enduring contribution of individual models to their work. And this is something that recent scholarship has really helped to foreground in our appreciation of the human figure as a motif in American art of this time. Here you see the figure of Hetty Anderson, this young woman who in the 1890s would become one of St. Gaudens's primary models and was the primary model for the figure of Victory. She was a Black woman from Columbia, South Carolina, who moved to New York to explore a career in art. She became a prominent model and was able to contribute to many of the finest works of this period, both by St. Gaudens, Daniel Chester French, and many others. That sense of connection and relationship, St. Gaudens called her his favorite model, the most important one. He gave her his first study for the figure of Victory and actually cast it in bronze for her so that she could preserve it and remember her contribution to that figure. That sense of individual models, their relationship to the subject, I need not tell you that having the figure of Victory in the American Civil War be manifested in the figure of a Black woman is of particular significance. But it is quite remarkable that it went unrecognized until about the turn of the 21st century. Research has really helped us to understand more about how these works have become part of our consciousness and how compelling they remain to us even today. Here you see a drawing by Walter Sherlaw, The Telephone and the Ticker. This is a study for his mural for the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, a ceiling for the Manufacturers Building called The Uses of Electricity. Everyone, especially critics, talked about the figure of this young woman specifically as the type of a factory girl, that she is not the kind of dainty, winsome figure of a kind of idealized representation of youthful female beauty, but instead a sturdy young woman whose body has been defined by labor, by work. You see resounding musculature, you see the kind of forthrightness, the confidence, the stride, the energy. But you also see the ticker tape wrapped around her. You see the phone pressed to her ear. This is a young woman who has a device that she can use to call anyone anywhere on the world and also get real-time stock information simultaneously. So you can imagine that here we are in 1893. This technology is looking forward to a different age than the one in which Walter Sherlaw found himself, and with remarkable insight looked ahead not just to the sort of future of his own time, but to ours. That sense of connection to the sort of changing types of bodies of the time, to the modernity of the body, is very much a part of what made Americans' embrace of the figure in this period so unique, and also part of the wider practice of the human figure as a motif in art more broadly during this period. So it is striking to me to have the opportunity to look into these drawings and see the artists conceptualizing their ideas and communicating them so effectively. With that, I'd like to turn the microphone over to my colleague, Annette Blaugrund, who will tell us a little bit more about the wider context of American art at the expositions. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. World's fairs, as you now know, were a way to bring culture, history, and new technology together in one event to people from all walks of life. In my 12 minutes, I've been asked to speak about the benefit to American artists in the earliest World's Fairs in the United States, 1876 and 1893. Precursors to these were the Great Sanitary Fairs in 1864, held in Philadelphia, New York, and other cities to raise money for medicine, bandages, and aid to the Civil War indigent. They contained a diverse group of paintings and other objects, products, and curiosities. Included in New York were such Hudson River masterpieces as Albert Bierstadt's Rocky Mountains, Frederick Church's Heart of the Andes, and Emanuel Lewitz's Washington Crossing, the Delaware, all of which have been on view at the Metropolitan Museum for years. World's Fairs that usually celebrated historic occasions and introduced, among other things, you've already heard this, like the Ferris wheel, which was invented in 1893 for the Columbian Exposition. The fairs were idealized realms that provided information and entertainment while serving the interests of the host country. The first official World's Fair to be held in the United States took place in Philadelphia from May 10th to November 10th, 1876. The Centennial International Exhibition celebrated the 100th anniversary of the adoption of the Declaration of Independence in Philadelphia, July 4th, 1776. Officially, the title was the International Exhibition of Arts, Manufactures, and Products of the Soil and Mine. Visitors experienced displays of world cultures, but, and most importantly, it stimulated nationalism as it showcased the United States' industrial strength and ingenuity and its arts. It represented advantages in women's rights. Although women were initially excluded, they fought hard to get a women's pavilion and won because they provided money. Other displays perpetuated stereotypes of African Americans and Native Americans who were not allowed to present or attend. So many art contributions were received that a separate annex was built to house them. Another structure was built for the display of photography. Artists were given the complete responsibility for assembling and installing the galleries, and despite disagreements, according to Kimberly Orcutt, an expert on the Centennial Fair, the final form of the exhibition was shaped by the practicalities of shipping, construction, and scheduling as much as any overarching aesthetic vision. Regional rivalries between art world leaders from Philadelphia, Boston, and New York played a significant role as well. As to the contents of the exhibition, Hudson River-style paintings outnumbered all others. Trying to erase memories of the Civil War just a decade past, there was an official ban on paintings portraying the war. However, Peter Rothenball's Battle of Gettysburg was snuck in and it forced viewers to confront recent history. Yet, Thomas Aiken's Gross Clinic, now an American art icon, was totally rejected, probably for its gore, nudity, and inappropriate subject. Despite that, It's sold during the time of the fair, but for $200. Overall, the art displayed created a discussion of what was American art and helped to establish a cultural identity. The Chicago World's Fair, also known as the World's Columbian Exposition, was held from May 5th to October 31st, 1893. It commemorated the 400th anniversary of Christopher Columbus's arrival in the New World in 1492. The centerpiece of the fair was a large water pool representing Columbus's voyage to the New World, surrounded, as you can see, by palatial Beaux-Arts neoclassical buildings. Chicago had reconstructed itself after the disastrous fire in 1871 into, quote, the city beautiful, with new roads, railroads, skyscrapers, and the establishment of cultural institutions. The exposition was an influential social and cultural event and had a profound effect on American architecture, American art, American industrial optimism, and Chicago's image. The most controversial building was the Women's Building, inspired by the one in 1876, to exhibit outstanding works by women and to advance women's interests. Controversies about which artists, what subjects, and how many works by each artist ensued at all of these fairs, as it had in its prototype, the 1889 World's Fair in Paris, for which, as you've heard, the Eiffel Tower was the symbol. There, the American art shown in the Fine Arts Building separated art that was considered American, like Thomas Hovenman's Last Moments of John Brown, from that which was influenced by the schools of Paris, like J. Alden Weir's Lengthening Shadows. For the 1889 World's Fair, there were two artist selection committees, one in the States and one in Paris, where so many American artists were studying in the French ateliers. The paintings shown there were thus divided into artists painting in the French style and subjects, as for example, George Hitchcock's Annunciation Lilies, versus those working in the States on American subjects, such as J.G. Brown's Morning Papers. The paintings and sculptures selected for the Chicago Fair was the largest art exhibit in the history of this country. Finding new sources of inspiration in Europe, artists were asserting that American art had come of age on the international stage. A national jury of artists from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia selected landscapes, portraits, genre, historical, and allegorical subjects. Realist paintings by Thomas Eakins and Winslow Homer, who's herring fishing, American scenes by Eastman Johnson, as well as Barbizon-inspired peasants by Charles Sprague Pierce, and the crisp renderings of Frank Millet were contrasted with works by William Merritt Chase and the bravura brushwork of John Singer Sargent. All were professional, well-established artists, many of whom had participated in the 1876 fair. Homer and George Inness were singled out as the most American, and Whistler and Sargent were the most talked about. This fair achieved the goal of showing the accomplishments of American artists since 1876. So you see, World's Fairs served as a vital platform for artists to advance their careers and engage in a broader cultural context. First, they provided artists with opportunities to sell their work directly to attendees, which afforded them financial support, and increased demand for their art. For example, Whistler, William Merritt Chase, and John Singer Sargent were then asked to send their paintings on to the Pennsylvania Academy for an exhibition there. This led to Whistler's arrangement in black portrait of Lady Archibald Campbell being bought for the Philadelphia Museum of Art in 1895, the first Whistler painting to enter an American museum. Second, fairs allowed artists to network with potential patrons, gallery office owners, and fellow artists, which could lead to future opportunities for American and foreign artists alike. The Norwegian artist Harriet Bakker's painting, Christening at Tanham Church, was acquired from the fair by the St. Louis Art Museum. However, in 1899, it was sold subsequently to the National Gallery in Oslo. Third, exhibiting at a major international event provided artists with unprecedented exposure to diverse audiences, including critics, collectors, and the general public. Being selected to exhibit at a World's Fair helped to elevate an artist's status in the art community. It also fostered a dialogue among artists and introduced new ideas and techniques that could influence their work. World's Fairs continue to be held in both Europe and the United States, supplying these advantages to participating artists from around the world. Similar events survive today, such as this winter antique show. Thank you.
Hello, thank you all for staying with us. We've only scratched the surface of all of the aspects of what these World's Fairs brought to the sensibilities of the American public and worldwide. That's why we call it just part of the World Wide Web of taste. But I wanted to ask the panel, the exposure to the art in these expositions, the Hall of Manufacturers and the Palaces of Fine Arts, was just a microcosm of what was being acquired on a private level by the great early collectors of the day. Can each of you talk briefly about a difference between the public face of art that was represented at the fairs and the private channels of collecting and patronage which were actually going on outside of these venues?
Well, when you're thinking about Tiffany, I'm not sure there's a lot of difference. I mean, people are shopping at different levels. The kinds of things that they're selling and featuring at the fairs are not their normal sort of merchandise, and they're often really loss leaders because of the publicity that they can generate. But they did bring certain kinds of patrons, and the ones who bought over and over again. Things like the Magnolia vase were bought by a woman collector who went on to buy other things, many of which she ended up giving to the museum, the Metropolitan Museum, not long thereafter. And if I think about it in terms of someone like Moore and his collecting, you're right, it's a very small part of the entire story. The exposure I think that these fairs provide sparks interest that then finds outlet through an incredibly rich array of dealers, people who are traveling to different parts of the world and providing things for collectors to acquire. So when I look at him and Havemeyer and some of those collectors, it is in a way just the sort of tip of the iceberg, and that the network of dealers, a lot of the material Moore collected really wasn't available in New York. He was collecting in London and Paris. And so this kind of international marketplace for goods and for collectors to sort of begin to build these extraordinary collections is depending upon a whole host of, if that's responsive.
I would love to go next because I would like to sort of respond to that, because in the fine arts, especially for artists who work for public commissions, the opposite is true, which is to say that these fairs and then the commissions that they got as a result of these fairs, where their work was exhibited on display, you could see these vast murals that they contributed, usually on very accelerated timelines, became the foundation of their reputations. And they were able to get $10,000, $25,000 commissions for large-scale public commissions for courthouses, libraries, universities, train stations, the occasional armory, and they were able to sort of build whole careers based on the fairs. That was the kind of opportunity that then led to more and more of this work, and very well compensated. These are individuals, often working in geographically disparate places, trying to create large-scale works, and they often worked in very close-knit communities at the fairs themselves. So that's where their references came from, was from their peers and from the people who commissioned them for the fairs themselves.
I'd like to add another aspect. Not all the art was for sale. Often, collectors would lend their pieces to the fairs. So they wanted to show American art at its best, and if they happened to own one, they lent it to be shown.
It's worth mentioning, Tiffany borrowed quite a lot of silver that people had already acquired, or yachting trophies that had already been presented. So it's same sort of hybrid presentations are happening there too.
When it comes to the Chicago exhibition, it's very important to remember, in the case of Japanese art, to keep in mind this very sharp distinction between the Palace of Fine Arts, quite a small display, very, very well documented, and the Hall of Manufacturers and Liberal Arts, absolutely vast, a high turnover. Things that were shown there didn't stay there all the time. As things were sold, new ones were brought in, and there's also some evidence of pieces moving between the Palace of Fine Arts and into the Hall of Liberal Manufacturers, 20 times its size. So as far as the Japanese government was concerned with the Japanese fine arts, they were not really there for sale. And all the pieces you saw in my presentation, with the exception of the huge tapestry in the Chicago Field Museum, went back to Japan, and all but one of them are in Tokyo National Museum to this day. So tracing the influence of somewhere like Chicago on American collecting is more difficult, because we don't have a lot of documentation about what was in the Hall of Manufacturers. We have some photographs, and believe me, the displays are absolutely rammed with things of every size, from 10 feet high down to as little as this, and you see crowds of people going through, and everything's for sale. Somebody like Namikawa Yasuyuki, whose pair of vases we saw just at the end of my presentation, he didn't actually need any of this. He had created in Kyoto a fantastic, quote, authentic, unquote, experience for globetrotters, many of them American, to enjoy. You go in a certain way, and if you read the globetrotting books that were published when these people came back to London or New York in the 1890s, each one of them gives an account of their Namikawa experience, and it's all the same, and it's all a very, very sharp, clever marketing operation. So those things are being sold in Japan. But speaking to my own experience with the really great collections in the United States, and Boston in particular, of course, 90% of what had been purchased up to, say, 1920 had been bought in Japan. Fenellosa collected, William Sturgis Bigelow collected enormously in Japan. Before, he'd been in Paris for a little while and acquired a little bit of this and a little bit of that, but nothing important. Edward Sylvester Morse's collection, of course, was formed in Japan with the specific purpose of creating a display that would show the whole history of Japanese ceramics in the light of our contemporary knowledge. Not enormously successfully, but still very interesting. And Fenellosa himself and Okakura Kakuzo were actively buying masterpieces of early Buddhist art and things like that, but never went anywhere near the big expositions, and they were buying them, and they were going directly to collectors in New England and often eventually into the Museum of Fine Arts. So there's a very mixed picture.
And remember that the Museum of Fine Arts opened its home in 1876 on Copley Square. And so that is, I mean, this is the Philadelphia Museum of Art is founded at the centennial. The Boston Museum opens their building the same year. So it is quite a generative moment from many different aspects.
I would like to turn to the audience, and I'm sure some of you have questions, and I'd like to open it up to any questions that you may have. Yes, in the back?
When and why did World Fair stop?
They didn't. They didn't. No, they didn't. They're still going on, actually. They've changed their character. And some of them have evolved into the Olympic Games, as we see, which started from Athens, Greece in 1900. But they're still going on. We're just focusing on the important American founding of the World Fairs in the United States.
Well, and they are really more sort of trade fairs at this point. I mean, we wouldn't recognize them as the huge phenomenon that they were in the 19th century. So embedded in that question is a really interesting question. Why did that shift happen and they became much more sort of narrower audiences and a very different animal? I don't know the answer to that question.
But they were still very prominent in the middle of the 20th century and the Cold War. I mean, they became instruments of international diplomacy as well. So, you think about the rise of Nazism and you think about the role of fairs in that, trying to reform one's reputation on the world stage. You think about certainly many opportunities for competing powers to present themselves, and that really remains very true through the 50s and 60s in the middle of the 20th century.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking today they don't have that much gravitas, but.
I mean, the Japanese continued to regard fine art as particularly with the rise of imperialism in the 1930s, a very, very potent propaganda tool. And the largest of all the official national exhibitions that began in 1907 was held in 1940. Because it marked the 2600th anniversary, supposedly, of the Japanese imperial dynasty. So that was obviously it was a very nice that they needed an exhibition in 1940, and they had the nice anniversary to make it work. But it's on a larger scale than anything ever attempted between 1907 and the present day. And I just wanted to say, if you take the cab from JFK over to Manhattan, you'll see along the way the remnants of is it the 1964 World's Fair here, and there are a few bits and pieces still hanging on in there.
Other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. It's wonderful to have had you all here. We appreciate it.